A general walks into the Prime Minister's office. The city burns in rain and anger. People shout for resignation, soldiers march for order. Two forces collide, chaos and command, and the island holds its breath. In Sahel, this moment already has a name, sovereignty. But here, it's still a question. Did Madagascar just save itself from collapse? Or step into a new kind of revolution? Stay with us. Because what happened at night may rewrite Africa's map of power. 12 days of protest had turned Madagascar's capital into a storm. Students, workers, and mothers filled the streets, chanting against corruption and hunger. In a move to restore stability, President Andry Rajoelina dissolved his government and appointed General Rufin Fortunate Zafasambo as the new prime minister. The decision was meant to calm the fury, but the streets did not fall silent. Crowds kept marching, refusing to accept a civilian crisis solved by military hands. We asked for justice. Not uniforms, one young protester said. Yet across Africa, the image of a general taking charge once again raised a familiar question: is this chaos? Or the beginning of a sovereign order? The streets of Antananarivo no longer sleep. From dawn till nightfall, the city hums with chants, drums, and anger. Mothers carry empty pots to protest against hunger. Students wave hand-painted flags that read, "Our future is not for sale." It is not chaos, it is exhaustion turned into rhythm, frustration turned into faith. Faith that maybe, this time, someone will listen. For years, Madagascar has lived on promises. Every election, a new voice promised a new dawn, and every dawn turned into the same gray morning. The people have memorized the language of disappointment, reform, development, growth. Words that built no schools, filled no stomachs, fixed no roads. And in that vacuum of trust, the army waited. Silently. Patiently. When the decree came, the appointment of a general as prime minister, the city froze. Some clapped. Some jeered. Others simply watched the horizon, as if trying to guess which way history would lean. One elderly man, holding a torn national flag, whispered to a journalist. "Maybe we needed the discipline before we could have democracy." His voice cracked, not from fear, but from memory. Because they remember. They remember when soldiers were still sons of farmers. When uniforms carried dust, not privilege. They remember when the word duty was heavier than any campaign slogan. And deep down, amid the smoke and slogans, many believe that only those who've stood guard in silence can restore what politics has broken. The protests did not stop because anger is not a switch, it is a wound. But the tone changed. When armored vehicles passed, no stones were thrown. When soldiers stood at intersections, the crowd paused, some saluted, some stared. Between the two sides, an unspoken recognition formed: you keep the peace, we keep the hope. That night, while the president's office released statements of stability, the streets told a different story. A young woman, barefoot in the rain, stood on a concrete barrier and shouted, "If the president cannot lead, the army must." Her voice cut through the storm. The cameras caught it. It spread across social media like wildfire. And within hours, the slogan became a movement: the army must. It wasn't a call for tyranny. It was a call for responsibility. In a continent scarred by foreign promises and internal betrayal, the people of Madagascar had seen enough of polished politicians who begged for aid while their citizens begged for food. To them, a soldier's word carried more weight than a diplomat's speech. They were not asking for power, they were asking for protection. Across the Sahel, soldiers in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger watched the footage. They recognized the rhythm, the desperation, the yearning for dignity. They had lived it. And perhaps, in the quiet corners of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, someone whispered, "Another one has awakened." For outsiders, it was easy to dismiss it as instability. But for Africa, it felt like symmetry, a continent finding its balance after centuries of leaning toward others. In this balance, generals do not overthrow nations, they guard them. They step forward when politics has failed. And they return to the ranks once order is restored. That is the belief spreading like thunder from the Sahel to the Indian Ocean, that sovereignty needs structure, and structure begins with discipline. On the 12th night, a group of protesters lit candles in front of the palace gates. The flicker of their light met the steel reflection of soldiers' helmets. One of the officers, young, barely 30, whispered to his comrade, "They are not our enemies." The other nodded. "No," he said. "They are the reason we wear this uniform." Somewhere behind those walls, General Zafasambo was already writing his first directive. Not a manifesto. Not a speech. But a simple order to secure food convoys for the capital's poorest districts. He knew symbolism mattered. But bread mattered more. And for the first time, even critics admitted, a soldier's decision had reached the people faster than any politician's promise. The question now was no longer, why the army, but why not sooner? If corruption could wear suits, why couldn't integrity wear boots? By the end of that week, even in distant towns, murals began to appear, paintings of a soldier shielding a child from the rain. The caption underneath, "The nation has a new guard." It was not propaganda. It was poetry. The kind born from exhaustion, yet written in hope. In one of the city squares, an old teacher looked at his students and said softly, "This island has seen kings, presidents, and priests. Perhaps now it needs guardians." The children nodded, though they barely understood. But in their eyes was something Madagascar hadn't seen in years, belief. As dawn broke over the city, the streets were still wet, but quieter. The protests had not ended, they had transformed. Placards once painted with anger now carried single words: order, respect, sovereignty. No leader could have choreographed that. It came from the people, from the raw instinct of a nation rediscovering its backbone. A general had entered the government. But something larger had entered the people, the sense that they were no longer waiting for salvation from abroad. They were becoming their own saviors. In the coming days, Western headlines would frame it as a military turn. But for those living it, this was not a turn. It was a return, to dignity, to discipline, to self-respect. And somewhere, between the roar of the crowds and the silence of the barracks, a single thought echoed across Africa. If sovereignty demands strength, then strength must lead. If leadership demands courage, then courage must wear the uniform. Madagascar had chosen its path, not through ballots, but through resolve. And now, the world would watch whether this island, long forgotten, could become the next frontier of Africa's awakening. Because sometimes, the map of freedom isn't drawn by politicians. It's redrawn by those who still remember what they swore to protect. Who is the man behind the uniform? That question filled the streets of Madagascar as the news spread. In cafes and crowded markets, his name was repeated with both curiosity and relief: Rufin Fortunate Zafasambo, a general with no scandals. No campaign posters, no history of ambition. To most, he was a mystery. To those who served with him, he was the embodiment of discipline. He was not a politician in disguise, nor a celebrity in uniform. He was a soldier who had spent years in the quiet corridors of command, serving as director of the military cabinet under the previous government. His job was not to talk, but to listen, and to remember what others forgot, that leadership is not volume, it's weight. When Zafasambo entered the Prime Minister's office, he carried no entourage, no media team, no applause. Just the measured footsteps of a man who had waited long enough for words to lose their meaning. The cameras captured only a nod, one that spoke louder than speeches. He didn't promise miracles. He promised motion. In the first hours of his tenure, he visited the army barracks, not to celebrate, but to remind. "We serve the Republic," he said. His voice calm but firm. Not men. Not parties. The Republic. The soldiers saluted in silence. No slogans, no fanfare. Just the sound of boots against concrete, the heartbeat of discipline. That night, he refused the official dinner planned by the presidency. Instead, he drove, without escort, to a hospital treating those injured in the protests. When a nurse tried to stand to greet him, he raised his hand softly. "Stay," he said. "I came to see, not to be seen." He shook the hands of doctors, not journalists. When asked later why he went, he replied, "Because a wounded nation cannot be healed from an office." It was a gesture small in size, enormous in symbol. In a continent tired of leaders arriving late, Zafasambo showed up early, to duty, to crisis, to pain. Within a week, the tone of the streets shifted. Posters began to appear, "The General walks with us." Not crafted by the state, but by the people. His quiet presence, his refusal to give grand speeches, made him paradoxically louder than any politician. Because in Madagascar, silence had become the rarest language of integrity. He didn't speak often, but when he did, every word felt carved in stone. When a journalist asked if he feared losing popularity, he answered simply, "Popularity is a campaign. Duty is a lifetime." That quote spread faster than the protests themselves. Because in a country where slogans had replaced substance, those words sounded like water after years of dust. Inside his office, Zafasambo worked as he had always done, like a soldier, not a celebrity. He met with ministers, set deadlines, and banned ceremonial titles from internal memos. "We are not honorable," he said. "We are responsible." It wasn't poetry. It was policy. Every morning at dawn, his convoy passed through the poorest neighborhoods, no sirens, no barricades. Children waved, women pointed. For them, a passing motorcade no longer symbolized fear, but proof that someone was finally watching. And in that watching, there was dignity. To understand Zafasambo, one must understand his silence. It wasn't emptiness, it was the space where purpose lives. He spoke little because he had seen too much. The civil unrest of 2009. The hunger protests of 2018, the slow erosion of trust. He had learned that the louder the state spoke, the less the people believed. So he rebuilt belief the only way he knew, by doing. Reports from the ministries began to change tone. Budgets trimmed, inspections reinstated, salaries delayed for absent officials. It wasn't glamorous governance, but it was real. And in a nation long starved of accountability, realism felt revolutionary. On the 8th day of his appointment, the press published a photograph that became emblematic, Zafasambo standing alone on the balcony of the Prime Minister's office at sunrise. Holding a cup of tea, staring at the flag. No caption. None needed. The image went viral. The caption the people added themselves, "The dawn waits for the disciplined." He understood that power is a test, not a prize. In private meetings, he often quoted an old military saying, "The uniform is not protection from temptation, it is a reminder of it." Those who heard him say it described his eyes as tired, but alive, like someone who had carried too many secrets, but not lost his soul. Foreign envoys arrived in Antananarivo to gauge the new leader. They expected rhetoric, received resolve. When one Western diplomat asked whether Madagascar was following the path of military governance like the Sahel, Zafasambo smiled faintly. "We follow no one," he said. "But we respect those who stand for their land." It was both a message and a mirror, acknowledging the echo of the AES while asserting Madagascar's own rhythm. Behind closed doors, he began a plan that few anticipated, coordination with regional partners for food security and infrastructure. Modeled partly after the self-reliance philosophy of the AES states. "We won't wait for aid," he told his advisors. "We will build before we borrow." The phrase later appeared on banners across universities. Students called it the soldier's doctrine. His days blurred into nights. Meetings, inspections, directives, no chaos, just cadence. His staff learned quickly that Zafasambo measured time in results, not hours. And though he never said it aloud, everyone in that office felt it, the sense that the Republic had found its spine again. One evening, during a power outage, he refused to cancel a cabinet session. "Governments fall when lights go out," he said. "But nations rise when men stay seated." The ministers sat in the dim glow of candles, taking notes by hand. Outside, the rain tapped against the windows like applause. There was no myth-making, no cult of personality, only a slow, deliberate return to order. People no longer waited for miracles, they began to trust in maintenance. And in the eyes of many Africans watching from afar, Zafasambo had done something extraordinary. He made stability feel heroic again. The world often celebrates revolutions that shout. But sometimes, history is rewritten by those who whisper. By the 10th day, even foreign analysts conceded that Madagascar had avoided collapse not by accident, but by alignment, of duty, discipline, and destiny. For the people, the general was no longer just a man. He was a symbol, that perhaps Africa's next chapter would not be written in speeches or sanctions, but in service. As the camera pans out from his office window, the narrator's voice deepens. He did not seek power. He restored balance. He did not silence the streets. He steadied them. He did not command loyalty. He inspired it. Because in the end, leadership is not about leading the loudest, it's about standing the longest. And on that island, as the sun set over the red earth of Madagascar, one truth became impossible to ignore. The era of the soldier-statesman had begun. And beyond the horizon. In Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, 3 other men, Traoré, Goïta, and Tiani, would soon recognize a new brother across the sea. From the dust of the Sahel to the salt of the Indian Ocean, a new geometry of power is being drawn, not by diplomats, but by men in uniform who decided that sovereignty must no longer be a slogan. They never met in one room, but their visions met in the same sentence. Traoré in Ouagadougou, Goïta in Bamako, Tiani in Niamey, and now Zafasambo in Antananarivo. For names whispered across the continent like coordinates of awakening. The world called them military leaders. But Africa calls them something else, restorers. The Sahel Alliance, AES, was never just an agreement. It was a statement, that Africa's freedom was incomplete as long as it could be vetoed from abroad. That the gun once pointed at the people could become the shield of the republic. And that discipline, when joined with purpose, could rebuild what democracy without accountability had destroyed. When Zafasambo took office, he didn't announce a membership. He didn't need to. The symbolism was enough. From the first day he spoke, his tone echoed that same grammar of defiance, "We will build before we borrow." It was a sentence Traoré could have written himself. Across the Sahel, people watched footage from Madagascar on small radio screens. In a village near Mopti, a farmer laughed. Another captain without fear. In Niamey, an officer whispered, "The tide is spreading." And in Ouagadougou, a student wrote on a wall, "Sovereignty has 4 languages now." But it wasn't imitation. It was resonance. Because the idea of AES was never about geography, it was about gravity, the moral pull of nations refusing to kneel. Burkina Faso had declared that the soil belongs to those who defend it. Mali proved that unity can survive sanctions. Niger showed that dignity cannot be embargoed. And now Madagascar, an island once detached from continental struggles, stood as proof that the spirit of sovereignty had learned to swim. When the Sahel revolted, it was land reclaiming itself. When Madagascar rose, it was the ocean answering back. For decades, the Indian Ocean corridor had been a quiet spectator to Africa's transformations. Ports traded more than goods, they traded influence. Foreign bases dotted the map like chess pieces. But now, the same waters carried a different current, independence. Zafasambo's first foreign directive was subtle yet symbolic. He ordered a review of every external military agreement signed over the last decade, a quiet echo of what the AES did when they expelled foreign troops. No shouting. No rupture. Just a simple question in the nation's Security Council minutes: do these agreements protect our borders, or someone else's interests? It was the same question that had reshaped the Sahel. Behind closed doors, analysts began to whisper of a 4th axis, an invisible bridge connecting the deserts to the seas. Not through treaties, but through temperament. Not through signatures, but through shared scars. For the people of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the rise of Zafasambo was vindication. It proved their revolution was not isolation, it was inspiration. That their refusal to bow had awakened something older than colonial borders, the continental instinct of survival. In Ouagadougou, during an AES ceremony, a young officer mentioned Madagascar by name. He said, "When one soldier stands for his soil, it is courage. When four stand across a continent, it is destiny." The hall erupted in applause. That night, AES state television aired footage of Zafasambo's appointment speech. The anchor's final line became a motto across comment sections and classrooms. From Sahel to the sea, the chain of command is now the chain of sovereignty. But what binds them is more than rhetoric. Each of these men came from barracks, not ballot boxes. Yet each rose not to rule, but to repair. Each spoke of sovereignty not as a threat, but as therapy, a cure for dependency that had long disguised itself as development aid. And for millions of Africans watching from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, the message was unmistakable. The age of borrowed stability is ending. The era of self-discipline is beginning. It is easy for the outside world to see uniform and assume uniformity. But the AES model and the Madagascar moment are not copies, they are chords in a single song. Where the Sahel plays the rhythm of resistance, Madagascar adds the melody of restoration. Together, they compose the new African anthem, "We protect, therefore we exist." Inside Zafasambo's cabinet, a new term quietly appeared in draft policy documents, strategic sovereignty. Borrowed from neither East nor West, it became his blueprint for Madagascar's next chapter. It meant producing what they consume, defending what they own, teaching what they believe. No slogans, no ideology, just equilibrium. Meanwhile, the people could feel the shift. Prices stabilized. Roadblocks vanished. State media began broadcasting in rural dialects again. In small coastal villages, fishermen said the Navy now patrolled where foreign trawlers once roamed freely. "We have our sea back," one of them told a reporter. For a country long defined by its isolation, sovereignty was no longer theoretical, it was tangible. Beyond Africa, the signals were clear. Foreign capitals grew uneasy. They had seen this movie before, in the Sahel. They recognized the posture, the tone, the independence wrapped in humility. But this time, it wasn't just a desert storm. It was an ocean swell. Because the AES and Madagascar together redefined geography. They erased the idea that sovereignty is landlocked. They show that from desert sand to sea foam, one spirit can move entire continents. Some critics say this is militarization. But for those who lived through years of corruption and coercion, it feels more like moralization, a long-delayed correction to a century of misplaced trust. Under Zafasambo, Madagascar didn't declare war on anyone. It declared peace with itself. And that peace was contagious. In Mali, Goïta's officers watched Madagascar's reform on television and called it "order with ocean wind." In Burkina Faso, Traoré sent a message of solidarity, unofficial, but heartfelt, through intermediaries: "Hold your ground. The land respects those who respect themselves." And in Niger, Tiani reportedly told his generals, "History has found another compass." The alignment was unspoken but unmistakable. For the first time, Africa's sovereignty had not only borders, but rhythm. The Sahel beat the drum. Madagascar carried the echo. By the end of that month, political commentators coined a new term, the axis of integrity. They meant it mockingly. But for Africans watching, it sounded like prophecy. Because integrity, long absent from leadership, had finally found a uniform. Under the same stars that watched over the dunes of Timbuktu and the reefs of Nosy Be. A quiet understanding took shape. This was no longer about coups or governments. It was about guardianship. About men who remembered that nations, like barracks, fall when discipline sleeps. As the narrator's voice deepens, the camera sweeps across the continent map again, the glowing line from Sahel to sea pulsing brighter. This is not the rise of militarism. It is the return of responsibility. A response born not from conquest, but from conscience. In the end, sovereignty is not about borders or ballots. It is about backbone. And in 2025, that backbone has 4 names: Traore, Goita, Tiani, Zafisambo. 4 men. 4 frontiers. 1 awakening. But every rise challenges an empire. And the empire is watching. It wasn't chaos that frightened the West this time, it was clarity. When General Delphin took the podium flanked by uniformed men, he didn't speak like a soldier serving a politician. He spoke like a nation reclaiming itself. The time for masks is over, he said. Madagascar must belong to its people again. The speech sent shockwaves through embassies in Antananarivo. Analysts whispered one phrase: the AES model. A civilian revolt, answered not by a coup, but by a recalibration, military order protecting popular sovereignty. No flag burning. No foreign consultants, no IMF press releases. Just a country closing its doors to chaos and opening them to purpose. But behind the applause was the quiet hum of risk. Would this new structure, led by generals, inspired by Sahel's defiance, truly be different from the old one? Burkina Faso's Traore had made the model work by uniting the army and the people around survival, not power. Mali and Niger had turned rebellion into rebirth. But Madagascar? Madagascar was an island, long conditioned by French dependency and fragile institutions. Could it stand the weight of its own awakening? Then came the unexpected, a surge of rural support. Farmers, miners, and fishermen, once ignored by the capital, began to march not against the military, but beside it. They saw in the soldiers not oppressors, but protectors. They called them the shield of the nation. The old political class tried to label it a coup. Western media ran headlines: Madagascar turns militaristic. Yet the images told another story: soldiers distributing rice, guarding hospitals, rebuilding bridges swept by storms. It looked less like a junta, and more like a reconstruction. Still, the defining moment came when Rajolina vanished from public view. Rumors spread: exile, negotiation, or surrender. The general remained silent. Power was no longer the conversation. Legitimacy was. For the first time in decades, Madagascar's fate wasn't being decided in Paris or Washington. And yet, the silence grew heavy. Because sovereignty, once tasted, demands clarity. Would General Delphin call elections? Would the army step back, or stay as guardians of a new republic? No one knew. But on the streets, people began to paint murals, bold red suns rising over the Indian Ocean. With the words, Tani Malalaka, Tanindrazana, free land, ancestral land. Madagascar was no longer asking permission to exist. It was asking how to lead. Under the crimson sky of Antananarivo, the crowd gathered one last time. There were no political banners, no party slogans, just one chant echoing through the night: let the people rule. The world watched, waiting for the familiar cycle: protests, promises, betrayal. But this time, something had shifted. The island was speaking in the language of sovereignty, not subservience. Madagascar had seen the mirror of Sahel, nations once broken now standing on their own feet. General Delphin's government may not be perfect. It may stumble. It may face storms. But it has done one thing no regime before dared: it placed the idea of nation above the theater of politics. And that is how revolutions begin, not with a gun, but with a refusal to kneel. So as Africa redraws its destiny, one truth resounds across the continent. From the red soil of the Sahel to the red earth of Madagascar, sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a decision.